December 15th, 1944. The thermometer read -12 degrees Fahrenheit. In a makeshift prisoner camp outside Munich, German women shivered in threadbare dresses, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. Then, something happened that would change everything they believed about their American captors. What happened next would not only save lives, but completely shatter everything both sides believed about their enemies. The German women had never imagined that the men they feared most would become their unlikely saviors. Make sure you're subscribed, because this story gets even more unbelievable. The camp itself was nothing more than hastily erected barbed wire fences surrounding a collection of wooden barracks that leaked cold through every crack and crevice. Originally designed to house male prisoners of war, the facility had been quickly repurposed when American forces began capturing increasing numbers of German women who had served in various capacities for the Reich. These weren't just random civilians caught in the crossfire. Many were nurses who had worked in field hospitals, communications operators who had managed radio equipment, and support staff who had kept German military operations running behind the scenes. The women arrived at the camp wearing whatever they had on when captured. Some still wore the remnants of their uniforms, now torn and stained from weeks of travel and processing through various detention centers. Others had been taken from their homes and wore simple dresses, many of which had seen better days even before the war began. None had been provided with adequate winter clothing during their journey to this remote facility in the Bavarian countryside. Among the prisoners was Ingrid Müller, a 28-year-old former field nurse who clutched a thin woolen shawl around her shoulders as she surveyed her new surroundings. The shawl had been a gift from her mother before she left for service, and now it represented one of her few remaining connections to home. Next to her stood Maria Fischer, barely 19 years old, who had worked as a telegraph operator until American forces overran her position. Maria's dress was more suited for a summer picnic than a German winter, and she had already developed a persistent cough during the journey to the camp. The American guards who supervised these prisoners were themselves far from home and dealing with the complexities of managing a facility they had never been trained to operate. Sergeant Michael O'Connor from Boston had enlisted right after Pearl Harbor and had fought his way across Europe from Normandy to this frozen corner of Germany. He had seen enough combat to last several lifetimes, but nothing had prepared him for the responsibility of overseeing female prisoners of war, especially as winter deepened its grip on the region. Private Tommy Williams, a farm boy from Iowa, had volunteered for the Army on his 18th birthday, driven by stories of German brutality that had filled American newspapers for years. He had expected to find monsters when he encountered German prisoners. Instead, he found himself looking at women who reminded him of his own sister back home, women who seemed just as cold, hungry, and frightened as he often felt. The initial interactions between guards and prisoners were marked by mutual suspicion and careful distance. The German women had been warned by their own propaganda that American soldiers were savage occupiers who showed no mercy to prisoners. They expected harsh treatment, inadequate food, and possibly worse. Their experiences during transport had done little to contradict these fears, as overwhelmed American logistics had struggled to provide even basic necessities for the massive number of prisoners being taken as German resistance crumbled. For their part, the American soldiers had been repeatedly briefed about the dangers of becoming too familiar with enemy prisoners. Military protocol demanded professional distance, and many soldiers harbored genuine anger toward any German personnel after witnessing the destruction and suffering caused by years of war. Some had lost close friends in battles against German forces, and forgiveness did not come easily in the bitter winter of 1944. Yet the physical reality of the camp made complete emotional detachment nearly impossible. The barracks were overcrowded, with women sleeping on thin straw mattresses that provided minimal insulation from the wooden floors. Small children accompanied some of the prisoners, adding another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. These children had committed no crimes beyond being born into wartime Germany, yet they shivered in the same inadequate clothing as their mothers. As December progressed and temperatures continued to drop, the humanitarian crisis became impossible to ignore. The approaching winter promised to be one of the harshest in recent memory, and the camp's heating systems were woefully inadequate for the number of people housed within its walls. What had seemed like a manageable situation during the relatively mild autumn months was rapidly becoming a matter of life and death. The night of December 18th brought a weather system that meteorologists would later describe as unprecedented in its severity. Temperatures plummeted to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and howling winds drove snow through every gap in the camp's hastily constructed buildings. The inadequate heating system, already struggling to warm the overcrowded barracks, began failing entirely as coal supplies ran dangerously low. What had been uncomfortable living conditions transformed overnight into a genuine survival crisis. Inside Barrack 7, Ingrid Müller wrapped her arms around 6-year-old Klaus, whose mother had died during an Allied bombing raid 3 weeks before capture. The boy had attached himself to Ingrid, and she had taken on the role of his protector, despite having no legal obligation to do so. Klaus's thin jacket, sized for a much smaller child, left his arms exposed to the bitter cold. His lips had taken on a bluish tinge that Ingrid recognized from her nursing experience as an early sign of hypothermia. Maria Fischer huddled in the corner with 3 other young women, all sharing a single blanket that provided little protection against the wind that whistled through gaps in the wooden walls. The persistent cough she had developed during transport had worsened considerably, and she struggled to catch her breath between fits of violent shivering. Her summer dress, already inadequate for normal winter conditions, offered virtually no protection against the Arctic conditions that had descended upon the camp. Throughout the barracks, similar scenes played out as mothers attempted to shield their children with their own bodies, elderly women doubled over in pain from the cold, and younger prisoners shared whatever meager clothing they possessed. The sound of chattering teeth created a constant background rhythm, punctuated by the cries of infants who could not understand why they felt so uncomfortable and cold. Outside, Sergeant O'Connor made his mandatory rounds, noting the frost that formed on his breath before it could dissipate in the wind. His regulation winter coat, lined with wool and designed for exactly these conditions, kept him reasonably warm despite the brutal temperatures. As he passed each barrack, he could hear the sounds of distress from within, and the contrast between his own comfort and the suffering of the prisoners became increasingly difficult to reconcile. Private Williams accompanied the sergeant on his rounds, his own winter gear providing adequate protection against the elements. As they approached Barrack 7, they heard a sound that stopped both men in their tracks. It was Klaus, crying not just from cold but from genuine fear, his young voice calling out for his mother in broken German phrases that needed no translation to convey their meaning. Through a crack in the wooden door, Williams caught a glimpse of Ingrid attempting to warm the boy with her breath while wrapping him in her thin shawl. The futility of her efforts was obvious even from a distance. The shawl, while precious to her emotionally, provided virtually no practical protection against temperatures that were literally life-threatening. Klaus's crying had awakened other children in the barrack, and soon a chorus of distressed voices filled the night air. The 2 American soldiers exchanged glances that conveyed more than words could express. Both men had younger siblings back home, and the sound of children in distress triggered protective instincts that transcended nationality or military protocol. O'Connor had received strict orders about maintaining proper distance from prisoners, but those orders had been written by officers who had never stood outside a freezing barrack listening to children cry from cold. Williams found himself thinking about his sister Emma, who was close to Klaus's age and probably sleeping safely in her warm bedroom back in Iowa at that very moment. The contrast between Emma's security and Klaus's suffering created a moral dissonance that made following regulation protocol increasingly difficult. Military training had prepared him for combat against enemy soldiers, but nothing had prepared him for witnessing the suffering of innocent children who happened to be on the wrong side of a war they had not chosen. As the night progressed and temperatures continued to drop, the situation inside the barracks deteriorated rapidly. Several elderly women had stopped shivering entirely, a dangerous sign that their bodies were no longer able to generate heat. Young mothers held their babies against their skin, trying desperately to share whatever warmth they could produce. The thin walls of the barracks provided little barrier against wind that seemed determined to strip away every trace of warmth from the building. Medical supplies at the camp were limited under the best of circumstances, and treating hypothermia required resources that simply did not exist in adequate quantities. The camp's small infirmary had been designed for minor injuries and routine medical needs, not for mass treatment of cold-related emergencies. Even if proper medical attention had been available, the fundamental problem remained the lack of adequate clothing and heating to prevent the crisis from worsening. By midnight, it became clear that without immediate intervention, the camp would likely experience its first cold-related deaths before dawn. The German female prisoners of war who had survived bombing raids, military defeats, and the chaos of capture now faced a different kind of battle against an enemy that showed no mercy and recognized no surrender. The bitter irony that they might perish, not from deliberate cruelty but from simple exposure, was not lost on anyone who understood the gravity of the situation developing in the frozen barracks. At 12:47 a.m., Sergeant O'Connor made a decision that would violate every regulation in the Army Handbook on prisoner management. Standing outside Barrack 7, listening to Klaus's increasingly weak cries, he began unbuttoning his regulation winter coat. The heavy wool garment, issued specifically for European winter combat, represented the difference between life and death in these conditions. Without it, O'Connor would face the same hypothermia risk as the prisoners he was supposed to guard. Private Williams watched in stunned silence as his sergeant removed the coat entirely, revealing only the standard olive-drab uniform underneath. The wind immediately cut through the thinner fabric, and O'Connor's body began responding to the cold within seconds. His decision defied not only military protocol, but basic survival instinct. Soldiers were explicitly forbidden from providing personal equipment to prisoners, and giving away essential cold weather gear could be considered dereliction of duty, punishable by court-martial. O'Connor pushed open the door to Barrack 7, and the blast of cold air that escaped revealed the desperate conditions inside. Women looked up with a mixture of fear and confusion as the American sergeant entered their living space, something that had never happened before during night hours. Ingrid instinctively pulled Klaus closer, uncertain whether this unexpected visit would bring help or additional hardship. Without speaking, O'Connor approached Ingrid and the shivering child. Klaus looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for his 6 years, eyes that had already seen more suffering than most people experience in a lifetime. The sergeant knelt down and gently wrapped his winter coat around both Ingrid and Klaus, ensuring that the boy was completely enclosed in the warm wool lining that still retained O'Connor's body heat. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Klaus's violent shivering began to subside within minutes, and his breathing became more regular as his small body started to warm. Ingrid felt tears forming in her eyes, not from cold, but from an emotion she had not expected to feel toward an American soldier. The kindness of the gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she had been told about her captors, that it fundamentally challenged her understanding of the situation. Other women in the barrack watched this scene unfold with amazement and disbelief. Maria Fischer, still coughing from her corner, stared in shock as the enemy soldier sacrificed his own protection to help a German child. The propaganda they had been fed about American brutality seemed impossible to reconcile with the reality of what they were witnessing. This man, who could have remained warm and safe outside, had voluntarily exposed himself to potentially fatal cold to help someone he had been trained to see as an enemy. Williams, still standing in the doorway, realized that his sergeant's action had created an expectation that could not be ignored. Other children in the barrack were looking at him with the same desperate hope that Klaus had shown, and the private found himself facing the same moral choice that had driven O'Connor's decision. His own winter coat, slightly smaller but equally warm, represented his protection against the brutal night that still had hours remaining. The moment of decision came when Williams noticed a woman in the far corner holding an infant who had stopped crying entirely. In his experience helping with farm animals back in Iowa, he knew that silence from a baby in distress often indicated a dangerous condition. The infant's stillness was not peaceful sleep, but the lethargy that accompanied severe hypothermia in the very young. Williams removed his coat without hesitation, crossing the barrack to reach the woman with the baby. She looked up at him with eyes filled with desperation and gratitude, understanding his intention even before he wrapped the warm garment around her and the infant. The coat's residual body heat immediately began working to reverse the baby's dangerous condition, and within minutes, the child began to show signs of renewed alertness. The two American soldiers now stood in the freezing barrack, wearing only their standard uniforms, exposed to the same life-threatening conditions as the prisoners they were supposed to guard. Their sacrifice was witnessed by more than 30 German women and children, all of whom had been conditioned to expect cruelty from their captors. Instead, they were seeing something that challenged every assumption they had held about the nature of their enemies. Word of what was happening in Barrack 7 began to spread quietly through the camp as other guards completed their rounds and discovered O'Connor and Williams inside the prisoner quarters. The sight of two American soldiers sharing the same dangerous conditions as their charges created a ripple of confusion and debate among the remaining guard staff. Some viewed the action as dangerously naive and potentially mutinous, while others found themselves questioning their own commitment to strict protocol enforcement. Corporal Jake Morrison from Detroit had been planning to report the unauthorized entry into prisoner quarters when he first discovered the situation. However, seeing Klaus sleeping peacefully in O'Connor's coat and witnessing the grateful tears of German mothers changed his perspective entirely. Morrison began to consider his own winter gear and the children in other barracks who were facing the same life-threatening conditions. The night was far from over, and temperatures showed no signs of improving. The decision made by O'Connor and Williams had saved immediate lives, but it had also created a precedent that would test the moral courage of every American soldier in the camp. The question was no longer whether regulations allowed such actions, but whether human decency demanded them regardless of military protocol. Within 30 minutes of O'Connor and Williams entering Barrack 7, the story of their sacrifice had spread through the guard rotation like wildfire. Corporal Morrison discovered himself unable to complete his rounds without stopping at Barrack 12, where he could hear the distressed cries of more children echoing through the thin walls. Inside, he found mothers desperately trying to shield their young ones from the killing cold, using nothing but summer clothing and threadbare blankets. What Morrison witnessed changed him instantly. A young German mother was breathing warm air onto her toddler's hands in a futile attempt to prevent frostbite. The child's fingers had already taken on the waxy pale appearance that Morrison recognized as the early stages of serious cold injury. Without conscious thought, Morrison began removing his own winter coat, his hands moving faster than his mind could process the implications. The German women in Barrack 12 reacted with stunned disbelief. They had spent months being told that American soldiers were monsters who delighted in German suffering. Yet, here was another enemy soldier voluntarily exposing himself to mortal danger to protect German children. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, forcing these women to confront the possibility that everything they had believed about their captors might be fundamentally wrong. Private First Class Robert Chen found himself outside Barrack 15 wrestling with his own moral crisis. Chen had volunteered for military service partly to prove his American loyalty, and following regulations had always been his path to acceptance. Yet the sounds emerging from the barrack made regulation compliance seem not just wrong, but evil. Inside, Chen discovered Greta Hoffmann, a 45-year-old former hospital administrator, attempting to care for 8 children whose mothers had been separated during processing. Greta had managed to gather all the children into a tight group, using her own body and thin scarves to create a makeshift shelter. Her lips were blue from cold, and her movements had become sluggish in a way that Chen recognized as dangerous hypothermia symptoms. The sight of Greta sacrificing her own well-being to protect children who were not even her own broke through Chen's careful adherence to military protocol. He removed his winter coat and helped Greta wrap the children in its warmth, watching as their violent shivering began to subside. Greta looked up at Chen with an expression of profound gratitude that transcended language barriers entirely. As more American soldiers made similar choices throughout the night, the dynamic within the camp underwent a fundamental transformation. German women who had spent weeks avoiding eye contact with their guards suddenly found themselves sharing life-saving warmth provided by those same guards. The artificial barriers created by war, propaganda, and military hierarchy began crumbling under the weight of shared humanity. The response from the German female prisoners of war was as unexpected as the soldiers' actions. Instead of viewing the American sacrifice as weakness to be exploited, the women began organizing themselves to ensure that the borrowed coats provided maximum benefit. Ingrid, with her nursing background, took charge of monitoring the most vulnerable children and rotating the warm coats to prevent anyone from succumbing to hypothermia. Maria Fischer, despite her own persistent cough, began teaching other women breathing exercises that could help generate body heat. The irony that former enemies were now collaborating for mutual survival was not lost on anyone involved. The most profound change occurred in the children themselves. Klaus, warm and safe in Sergeant O'Connor's coat, began speaking to the American soldier in the few English words he had learned. His innocent attempts at communication created moments of connection that transcended the artificial divisions of wartime. Other children followed Klaus's example, tentatively approaching American soldiers who had shared their warmth. News of the night's events reached Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, who faced an unprecedented crisis of military discipline. His soldiers had violated explicit orders and potentially compromised their own safety. According to military law, Patterson should have ordered court-martial proceedings. Yet Patterson also understood that his soldiers had prevented multiple deaths and that forcing hypothermic children to return life-saving coats would essentially constitute murder. By dawn on December the 19th, word of the American soldiers' unprecedented actions had reached every corner of the camp, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate crisis of the brutal winter night. The surviving German female prisoners of war found themselves fundamentally reassessing everything they had believed about their captors, while the American soldiers discovered that their individual acts of conscience had collectively transformed the entire atmosphere of the facility. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson's morning inspection revealed a scene that defied every principle of traditional prisoner management. In Barrack 7, he found Sergeant O'Connor sitting beside Klaus, both sharing the warmth of the returned coat, while O'Connor taught the German boy to count in English. The sight of an American non-commissioned officer voluntarily spending off-duty time with an enemy child challenged Patterson's understanding of proper military conduct, yet the obvious bond between the two made any intervention seem cruel rather than necessary. The transformation was equally evident in the other barracks where coats had been shared during the night. German women who had previously cowered when American soldiers approached now greeted their protectors with cautious smiles and attempts at English conversation. Maria Fischer had begun teaching basic German phrases to Private Williams, creating an informal language exchange that violated numerous regulations about fraternization with enemy personnel. More significantly, the crisis had revealed organizational capabilities among the German female prisoners of war that camp administration had never recognized or utilized. Under Ingrid's informal leadership, the women had established a medical triage system for monitoring hypothermia symptoms and distributing warm clothing to those most at risk. Their efficiency in managing limited resources impressed even veteran soldiers who had witnessed military logistics operations across Europe. Greta Hoffmann had emerged as another unexpected leader, organizing educational activities for the children that kept them occupied and helped generate body heat through movement. Her background in hospital administration proved invaluable in creating systems for shared childcare, meal distribution, and basic sanitation that actually improved camp conditions for everyone. The most remarkable development was the emergence of collaborative projects between guards and prisoners that served mutual interests. Chen discovered that several of the German women had technical skills that could address persistent problems with the camp's heating system. Despite regulations prohibiting prisoners from accessing mechanical equipment, Patterson found himself authorizing their involvement when the alternative was continued life-threatening conditions. Working together, American soldiers and German female prisoners of war managed to improve the heating efficiency by nearly 40% within 3 days. The technical knowledge came from women who had worked in German factories and military installations, while the Americans provided tools and materials. The success of this collaboration suggested possibilities for cooperation that military doctrine had never considered. The changes extended beyond practical improvements to encompass fundamental shifts in daily interactions throughout the camp. American guards began learning the names of individual prisoners rather than simply referring to them by barrack numbers. German women started volunteering information about security concerns before they escalated into crises. The adversarial relationship that had characterized the camp's early months gradually gave way to something resembling functional community cooperation. These developments did not occur without resistance from both sides. Some American soldiers viewed the growing familiarity as dangerous softness that could compromise security. Similarly, some German women struggled with feelings of guilt and betrayal as they found themselves genuinely caring about the welfare of soldiers they had been taught to hate. Yet the practical benefits proved impossible to ignore. Camp incidents decreased dramatically as mutual respect replaced mutual suspicion. Health conditions improved not only because of better heating, but because German medical personnel began providing voluntary assistance with health care for both prisoners and guards. Perhaps most importantly, the children in the camp began displaying signs of psychological recovery that surprised everyone involved. The winter of 1944 eventually gave way to spring, but the bonds forged during that bitter December night proved more enduring than the season itself. As Allied forces pressed deeper into Germany and the war moved toward its inevitable conclusion, the small prisoner camp outside Munich became an unlikely model for humanitarian prisoner management that would influence post-war policies for decades to come. Klaus celebrated his 7th birthday in April 1945 with a party organized jointly by Ingrid and Sergeant O'Connor. The celebration featured a cake made from Red Cross supplies and decorations crafted by other German women in the camp, while American soldiers contributed candy and small toys sent from families back home. The image of former enemies singing Happy Birthday in 2 languages captured the extraordinary transformation that had occurred within the camp's barbed wire boundaries. The formal end of the war in May 1945 brought new challenges, as the camp transitioned from housing prisoners of war to managing displaced persons awaiting repatriation. Many of the German women expressed reluctance to leave the security and community they had found within the camp, while American soldiers faced the reality of permanent separation from people who had become friends rather than mere charges under their supervision. Ingrid Müller made the decision to emigrate to the United States after the war, sponsored by Sergeant O'Connor's family in Boston. Her nursing credentials, combined with glowing recommendations from American medical personnel who had worked with her during the camp's final months, enabled her transition to civilian life in America. Klaus accompanied her as her adopted son, and both maintained lifelong correspondence with O'Connor and his family. Maria Fischer returned to Germany but continued exchanging letters with Private Williams until his death in 1987. Their correspondence, preserved in the Williams family archives, documented the reconstruction of post-war Germany through the eyes of someone who had experienced American kindness during her darkest hour. Maria eventually became a teacher, dedicating her career to promoting international understanding and cultural exchange between former enemy nations. The heating system improvements pioneered through American-German collaboration in the camp became a template for similar projects in other displaced persons facilities throughout occupied Germany. The technical innovations, born from necessity and cooperation across enemy lines, demonstrated that practical problem-solving could transcend political and cultural barriers when human welfare was at stake. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson's detailed reports about the camp's transformation influenced Allied policy regarding prisoner and displaced person management throughout the remainder of the occupation period. His documentation of how humanitarian treatment actually improved security and efficiency challenged traditional military approaches to dealing with former enemy populations. Patterson later served as an advisor during the development of the Geneva Conventions, bringing first-hand experience of successful prisoner management to international humanitarian law discussions. The children who had been saved by American winter coats grew up to become teachers, doctors, engineers, and community leaders who carried memories of kindness across enemy lines throughout their lives. Klaus became a physician specializing in pediatric care, often telling colleagues that his career choice was inspired by watching adults from different nations collaborate to protect vulnerable children during wartime. Several of the American soldiers involved in that December night's events maintained contact with the German families they had helped long after returning to the United States. These relationships evolved into cultural exchange programs, student exchanges, and business partnerships that demonstrated how individual acts of compassion could create lasting bridges between nations that had been bitter enemies. Private Chen's decision to share his coat despite facing discrimination within American ranks became part of his family's immigration story, passed down through generations as an example of how moral courage could transcend personal suffering. His descendants established a scholarship fund for international students studying conflict resolution, specifically honoring individuals who demonstrated compassion across cultural and political divides. The barracks where coats were shared were eventually demolished as the camp transitioned to other uses, but photographs and testimonials preserved the memory of those crucial nights. These documents became part of historical archives, documenting the complexity of human relationships during wartime, showing how individual choices could create pockets of humanity within the broader context of international conflict. Modern historians studying the camp's records have noted that the winter coat incident marked a turning point, not only in prisoner-guard relationships, but in broader Allied approaches to post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. The success of cooperation between former enemies at the individual level provided evidence that larger-scale reconciliation efforts could succeed if built on foundations of mutual respect and shared humanity. The legacy of that frozen December night extends beyond the specific individuals who experienced it to influence contemporary discussions about humanitarian treatment during conflict, prisoner rights, and the potential for reconciliation between opposing groups. Military academies now study the camp's transformation as an example of how adherence to humanitarian principles can actually enhance rather than compromise security objectives. Perhaps most importantly, the story demonstrates that even in the darkest circumstances of international conflict, individual acts of kindness can create ripple effects that extend far beyond their immediate impact. The decision of a few American soldiers to share their winter coats with German female prisoners of war saved lives in the moment, but it also planted seeds of understanding that continued growing long after the last shot of World War II had been fired. The children who were kept warm by enemy coats grew up in a world where former adversaries became allies, where international cooperation replaced international conflict, and where the lessons learned in a small prisoner camp contributed to a broader understanding that shared humanity transcends the artificial divisions created by war. Their story reminds us that compassion, once offered across enemy lines, has the power to reshape not only individual relationships, but the entire trajectory of international relations for generations to come.